Right, welcome back to our second video for this week. Now I'm going to be talking about the Manyoshu, the collection of 10,000 leaves, as it's called, Manyo, 10,000 leaves. The first major imperial anthology of poetry. The thing is huge. It doesn't quite have 10,000 poems, but sure is close. So let's see. Let's bring back up our outline here. So the Manyoshu was compiled over quite a long period of time, and it covers a lot of, as the header notes in your reading for this week will indicate, it's around 785 of the Common Era CE. So from this point on, I'm not going to write CE anymore since we're not dealing with both BCE and CE. So if there's a date that's listed, it's CE. So the Manyoshu is, as I said earlier, so it's the collection of 10,000 leaves. Not just leaves in the sense, like this isn't just a metaphor. This also has to do with the fact that the word kotoba in Japanese literally means like leaves of speech, or sort of leaves of speaking. So that's 10,000 leaves. It's 10,000 of those utterances. The leaves themselves are emblematic of the utterances. And this is one of the first texts you get in Japanese that is purely in Japanese. However, it's Japanese written in Chinese characters in what is referred to in a form of writing that is called Manyol Gana. So it's the Manyol from Manyoshu. So it's the kana. So it's the form of writing that you see in the Manyol or Manyoshu. And this is the pretty much, it's not the only place where you see it, but it's definitely associated primarily with this text. And to give you an example of what this looks like. So this is interesting because for those of you who are Chinese speakers, you're probably going to be extremely confused by this. This, you really can't read, unlike the Kojiki, where you could sort of read it, you could mostly read it as classical Chinese. You can't read this as Chinese at all. In fact, if you try to read it as Chinese, you'll actually be more confused than anything else. But it's also not purely phonetic. So some characters are read for their semantic value. So here the word ko is read for its semantic value. It's read as for basket. It's the word for basket. It's right there, basket. These two characters, however, are only read for their phonetic value. So it's ko mo yo, and then miko mochi. So komoyo, miko mochi. So the mi here is read for its phonetic value. I wish I actually had you guys like in class with me right now. We were sitting in a classroom, because I'm fairly certain you would all be giggling to yourselves at this phrase right here, because it's not a phrase, only this is an actual word. So we have mi, ko, and then this is read as ko, but it's semantic basket as well. And then for mochi, like this has got to be a joke. I really have to think that this is a joke, because whoever compiled, so this is only being read for its sound value, mochi. So the from motsu, the Japanese verb to have or to hold. So holding a beautiful basket is what that's supposed to say, or holding a marvelous or a beloved basket. There, again, this has got to be a joke. Okay, for those of you who don't speak Chinese, I'll explain this. So this is the word for mother, and this is the word for milk. So this phrase here is mother's milk or breast milk. So this would be like the beautiful basket breast milk is literally what that says, which is very strange. But again, I have to think this is a joke. Maybe it's just an honest mistake. But yeah, no, these are only being read for their phonetic value. So komoyo mi komochi. So, and to take a look at this, so this is the translation. So komoyo mi komochi, your basket with your lovely basket. Fukushimoyo mi bukushimochi. So your trowel with your lovely trowel. Yeah, so that's what makes this text especially difficult to read, is that sometimes characters are being read for their semantic value, but sometimes they're being read purely for their phonetic value. But this is but none of this is to be read as Chinese. In fact, like I said, if you read it as Chinese, some funny things will start to happen in the text. So don't do that, or do that and have a lot of fun with it, I guess. So that's sort of the interesting thing with the language. The other thing that's worth knowing is that so here we have the not the earliest, but sort of the best introduction to the fundamental structure of Japanese poetry. For basically a solid, from this point to at least, basically for about 1,000 years, poetry is going to be poetry in Japanese, because they also wrote poetry in Chinese as well, called kanji. Poetry in Japanese is going to be written using this basic like 5-7 syllabic structure. So a 5-syllable phrase followed by a 7-syllable phrase. Sometimes these are understood as single lines, and I do find it kind of curious that, so page 38 was the example and I wanted to use. Oh yeah, this poem. So this is a poem by Jome. His dates are up there. This is in the reading I sent you guys. From my perspective, I'm doing it in the future, but from your perspective, it will have already been done. So that's kind of curious for me to think about. So here, let's look at this line right here. So the translation in Yamato. Remember, Yamato is a province amid a ring of hills. So this line right here. So I'm going to do this. Yamato ni wa. So that's 5 syllables. Murayama ari to, 7 syllables. So we have 5 syllables plus 7 syllables, 7 syllables. And that is sort of right there is the sort of the basic structure of traditional Japanese poetry. So in Yamato, and you see this in every single line. So let's take the next line as well. Tori yorou ame no kaguyama, 7. 登れ立ち国見をすれば、国原は煙立ち立つ。うな原は釜め立ち立つ。うまし国ぞ、so? This is actually supposed to be zo. うまし国ぞ、秋津島、大和の国は。And so, what's interesting is that so this is what is known as a choka. I'm going to be skipping. So I had this laid out differently, but I'm going to be skipping. So choka right here. And this is pretty much like the shortest choka, not the shortest possible, but it's definitely pretty short. But the way you know it's a choka is because you have 5-7, 5-7, 5-7, 5-7, 5-7, 5-7, 5-7, and then you know that the poem ends when you have another 7-syllable phrase. Yamato no kuni wa. There's no 5 there, so it goes like 5-7, 5-7, 5-7, 5-7, 7. So if you get a 7-syllable line after a 7-syllable line, that's where you know where the end of the poem is, and that's how you know a choka has come to its conclusion. It's called a choka. It's called a long poem because the tanka is shorter. Anyway, this is not the typical way in which Japanese poetry is lineated when it's transliterated. I actually find it kind of cool. I don't know. No, I find it intriguing. I'll have to think about this. It's usually when these things are lineated, you'll have like each phrase is a line. So you'll have 5 syllables, so 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, et cetera, et cetera. This is different. It's just different. So, like I said, the basis of nearly all pre-modern Japanese poetry. There's also this distinction in Japanese poetry between uta, songs, and shi. So songs or uta are usually associated with verses in Japanese. So in Japanese, this right here, in English we would call this a poem, but in Japanese this is a song. This is an uta. The reason for that is because this word, shi, is usually reserved for Chinese poems. So that's why all of the compounds for types of Japanese poem use the uta, use the song ideogram, and why kanshi, for example, kanshi, sort of Chinese, literally Chinese poems, will use this. Part of the reason for this distinction between songs and poems in Japanese has to do with the fact that writing in Chinese was considered to be effeminate. And we'll talk a lot more about this in our next unit on the Heian period, while Chinese was considered to be a more masculine pursuit. So men were expected to learn to read and write Chinese, mostly because it was sort of the cultured language of the time. Whereas those who wrote in Japanese, it wasn't necessarily uncultured, but it was also considered to be more base, not quite as cool, I guess. And as a result of this, and again, we'll see this more in the unit on the Heian period, poets writing in Japanese, quite often, even when they were men, quite often adopt a more like effeminate or a female persona. And this is a thing that will become very common. It's not so common at this point in time. So the Manyoshu basically has two types of poem. Tanka, which literally means short song, a tanka. So like, and so for those of you who can read Chinese, you can see that right there, short song. It's pronounced tanka. This is at the very end of this document. So unfortunately, for whatever reason, I don't understand, but they only give you one example of a standalone tanka in this selection, which is very strange. So this is Yama no Ue no Okura. And it goes a little something like that. And this one they actually, so this is weird. So this one they actually did lineate 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. Huh, interesting. Okurara wa imo wa makaram. Ko nakuram. Sore sono haha mo wa matsuram zo. And now Okura really must be departing. My children must be crying, and their mother too must await my return. So a couple of things about Japanese poems of this, particularly the tanka. The tanka is usually sort of divided into two conceptual halves. And you can even see this in the translation. And now Okura really must be departing. My children must be crying, and their mother too must await my return. Generally, the conceptual break is actually between the third and the fourth. What are lines here? They're actually called phrases in Japanese, or ku. But here, but it doesn't have to be there. And so here the conceptual break is actually between the second and the third. So for in the next unit, we are going to see a bajillion of these. So maybe it's best that we don't talk about so many of them now, because we'll be reading so many tanka, your eyes will bleed. All right, the other major type of poem that we have in the Manyoshu is the so-called long song. These are not really innovative names. Or the choka. Sorry, let me get my glass of water. Best represented by probably the most famous poet in the entire anthology, Kakinomoto no Hitomaro, or he's usually just referred to as Hitomaro, but that's his full name, Hitomaro. As I said, most famous poet in the anthology. What's interesting about him is that we basically know nothing about this dude, aside from the biographical details that are revealed in his poems, which are actually, there's not a ton of them. So let's look at an example of one of his poems. So it's on page 42 of the, sorry, my webcam is actually covering the side of my monitor, so it's like I have to sort of look to see where it is. Alrighty, flighty. So I'm just going to read a bit of this in the English from the beginning. In the beginning of heaven and earth, on the riverbanks of celestial heaven, the 800 myriad gods, when in divine assembly they assembled, and in divine decision they decided that the heaven-shining sun woman, so you see her right there, Amaterasu, there she is, da, da, da. Sun woman sovereign would reign and rule in heaven, that in the land of rice and reed plains, and so that's the Ashihara, the reed plain. It's this metaphorical concept of like what the land is. Until heaven and earth came to a close, the divine sovereign was to reign and rule. They opened the eightfold. 8 is a really prominent number in sort of early Japanese mythology. They opened the eightfold heavenly clouds and in divine descent sent down the high shining sun prince, who in the palace of Kiyomi and Asuka. And so this is just, again, this is sort of like a pithier version of the story you guys read. This idea of like, there was the gods and the gods gave birth to humanity and the humanity became emperors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we want to focus on in this? So I noted in our previous discussion about the Kojiki, there are these elements of sort of duality that you see in these texts. And so here we have in the beginning of heaven and earth. And what's interesting here is that in the Japanese, this is not 3 words. It's actually 1 word. Ametsuchi. So literally heaven, earth. So Ametsuchi no hajime no toki. So in the time of the beginning of heaven, earth. So this is this duality, this sort of dual principle in play, heaven and earth. But literally you can see it in the way that sort of the Japanese word functions, where the two are sort of mushed together into one thing. These 2 fundamental, like, I guess you could say cosmological principles mashed together into one concept. On the riverbanks of celestial heaven, Hisakato no ama no kawarani. So again, we have sort of a short version, a very, very short version of this like origination myth. But Hitomaro is using this concept of what actually can introduce you to this already, what are called tsuiku, or sort of dual measures, or sort of like dualities. You could just call them dualities. So heaven and earth, like these things are sort of like opposites that are juxtaposed with each other, but it's not just like, oh, hey, look, he mentioned 2 things. It's more fun. It's different from that, because there's sort of like a kind of like Taoist thinking that is underlying it. It's 2 things that are sort of interacting with each other to create a cohesive whole, heaven and earth, and then literally as the one word in Japanese, ametsuchi. And you can even see this in the yin-yang symbol, where it's got like a white swirly half and it's got the black. So where the white swirly half comes, actually, it's on this side. For you guys, it's going to be different. Anyway, the point is that sort of like the white swirly half appears to be sort of going into the black swirly half, and the black swirly half, and sort of they look like they're sort of constantly in motion while also being 2 distinct things. It's a very cool, I guess you could say, cosmological principle. And you see that in play here in a literary fashion, where it's not just that he says, oh, hey, cool, it's 1 word, heaven and earth. It's not just that, but you can also see it working itself out in the poem, where the poem begins with this discussion of sort of the nature of heaven, and then who in the palace of Kiyomi and Asuka, being divine, firmly ruled and decreed. So then gives birth to, and so then Tenmu comes down. So there's this idea of like, you have the gods, and then you have the emperors who sort of mediate between the gods and the people. And then you get down to at the very end, as the poem progresses. So you have the gods at the top, at the head of the poem. You have the emperor between them at the middle of the poem. And then you have this description of the land, of sort of the world itself. The realm he is to reign and rule beneath heaven. May it flourish nobly like the spring blossoms. May it wax great like the full moon. Thus the people of the 4 corners beneath heaven. So we have heaven, the emperor beneath heaven, hope for his reign as if for a great ship, and wait in awe as for water from heaven. So the poem is, in content probably isn't all that interesting, like as far as like the wordsmithing goes. Like if this were a contemporary poem being workshopped at a famous university with a writers program, I'm currently living in Iowa City, so it's on the mind, then they probably look at this poem and go, okay. But you also have to think about sort of the way in which I mean, these people have a different like cosmological sense. Like what is beautiful and interesting to them is also based in part upon sort of the philosophical principles or sort of the religious slash philosophical principles that govern their lives. And for them, this goes all the way back to what I was talking about with the Shotoku Constitution, this idea of like harmony between, the heavens, the land, between the emperors and the ministers, that then the poem itself is trying to work that out. The poem is trying to be that harmonious interaction between sort of the two disparates. So, the poem begins with heaven and it ends with earth. And what mediates those two things, what mediates heaven and earth, is the emperor in the middle. So when the poem is written and it's constructed, you have sort of this description of like the cosmological aspects, the heavenly aspects of the universe, the emperor, and then the sort of the more earthly aspects of the universe, and then all of those working together in sort of the harmonious structure of the poem create this single unit, even though you have disparate things. Again, it goes back to that principle of like duality understood as ultimately forming a unity between heaven and earth, between the people and the emperor, between the gods and the emperor. Like all of these dualities are intermingling to create one harmonious whole. So that in the envoy poems at the end here, Hitomaro says, as though looking up at celestial heaven, we looked up in awe at the prince's palace, and now we grieve at its abandonment. So here he's dramatized. So what before was sort of apparent in the structure of the poem, so like heaven, emperor, earth, now he's dramatizing it from the perspective of someone below. So now it's sort of moving backwards because this is even further below the poem, literally, like it's below it physically. And so you see someone, actually, I mean, the we is an interpolation here. So looking up looking up at the emperor as if looking up at heaven. And then in the final envoy poem, by the way, these envoys are tanka, although the technical term for them is hanka, or anyway, they're identical to tanka, but that's not what they're called. Although the striking red sun shines, the moon crosses the black jewel night, and we grieve at its concealment. Now, again, this is a poem that probably seems fine enough unless you have a firm understanding of the sort of the cosmological principles that underlie it. Again, going back to that that yin yang symbol, the white half of the yin yang represents the yang principle, the sun. The black half represents the yin principle, the moon. And so the fact that the moon crosses the black jewel night, although the striking red sun shines, so you have sun and moon crossing paths with each other. It's a dramatization of the sort of the philosophical, or I guess you could say cosmological principle that underlies the poem itself. And so it creates this nice little cap, this literary cap for the whole thing. And it's kind of how you have to read, especially these poems, not necessarily later Japanese poems. They have different aesthetic issues going on, but definitely these poems are working in that vein. So that's the concept of the tsuiku, or the dual measure. Oh yeah, so makaro, so pillow words. Pillow words, yeah. Pillow words are essentially, they're not really that complicated of a concept. They're just like conventional epithets. And so you see one in this poem. It's this phrase right here, as if for a great ship. O buneno. So it takes a pillow word or pillow phrase, as I sometimes like to say. Not many people call them. They're usually called pillow words. Usually take up an entire syllabic phrase. So obune-no. So it's the whole 5-syllable phrase. And there's some form of conventional epithet, as if for a great ship, like a great ship. And they're conventional, but they're not necessarily cliched. They're more like, they're conventional in that they're epithets applied to specific things in a recurring fashion, but they're not really cliches, so to say. So the last major rhetorical figure that I want to talk about in these poems are the so-called Jo or Jokotaba, which are preface phrases. So there's an example on page 45. So this is another poem by Hitomaro. So, okay, I'll just read it's a fairly short choka, so I'll just read it. Our great lord of the eight corners, she who commands and rules all beneath heaven, although her lands are indeed many, it's worth noting. So you're probably kind of confused by the lord and she here. First of all, there's no pronouns in the Japanese here. They're not there. This is probably so okimi is used, lord. Okimi, although okimi can also, I believe, be used to refer to women. Anyway, the point is that it's the empress Chito. So I think what the translator is trying to do here is sort of like highlight the disjuncture between sort of the masculine okimi, the sort of the his lordship, but then it's a woman, she who commands and rules all beneath heaven. Although her lands are indeed many, for the clear pools of its mountain river, her heart is drawn to the land of Yoshino. And on the Akizu plains, where flowers scatter, she firmly builds the palace pillars, and thus the courtiers of the glorious palace line up the boats to cross the morning river and race the boats to cross the evening river. So again, we have another one of these Syracuse, these dual measures. So they line up the boats to cross the morning river and then race the boats back across the evening river. So it's the morning river, the evening river. This river that flows unceasingly, this mountain that commands the heights, the glorious palace by the surging water, we never tire to see. So this phrase actually, as I'll just show you then. The flows unceasingly statement refers both to sort of the river itself, but it's but it's the connection between sort of the image of the constant never stopping river, but then also the constant never stopping noble. I mean, Hitomaro himself was an aristocrat, and so his pledge, his vow to come back, is just as the river that never ceases to run. And it gets mentioned again here below. We never tire to see the eternal bed of the Yoshino River. May we return to see it flow unceasingly. So here's the vow itself in the hanka, in the envoy that's attached. So the poem is this. So it's a poem of praise for the Empress Jito, but then also it's a song of praise for the land of Yoshino, which is an important religious, I guess you could say, place in Japan in early pre-modern Japan. And then you get your typical, like, she's such a great empress because she builds everything correctly. Again, so this emphasis on like everything is in its place, everything is harmonious, everything's where it should be. And the people all come to do this dual measure, lining up the boats to race across the morning river, et cetera, et cetera. This river that flows unceasingly, this mountain that commands the heights. And again, you see this another duality. So you have the height of the mountain, the river, and the valley sort of interacting with each other. The glorious palace by the surging water. Again, the third term being the imperial one. So you have the mountain, you have the high thing, you have the heavenly part, you have the river, you have the low-lying thing, the earth part. And then the third term, just like with the previous poem, the glorious palace that sits beside the surging water. So it's along the bank of the mountain. It's not at the top of the mountain, but it's also not in the river. It's between the two of them. And what is it? It's the imperial. It's this palace in Yoshino. It's associated with the imperial family. So again, the emperor is put as sort of the mediating point between the heavenly and the earthly thing. And from the poet's perspective, then he appends this bit at the end: may we never tire to see the eternal bed of the Yoshino River. And so it's not just, he's not just saying like, may we never cease to come back to Yoshino and see its beautiful waters, but he's also saying, may we never be inconstant to the empress. There's this implication like, may we always come back to this place just as we always remain loyal to the empress. There you go. So that's the sort of political undercurrent of the poem, if you will, because you often have to read these poems in a somewhat allegorical fashion. Oh, did I show you guys the picture of? Yeah, Yamato Takeru. I guess I didn't before. Anyway, that's a picture of him. All right. Is there anything else I wanted to cover with these poems? No, and I'm getting to about sort of the half-hour mark for this. All right, so I think I'm going to stop it there from now. As per usual, we will have our meeting. I hope some of you will be able to attend on Wednesday at 2:15 Eastern Standard Time, or I guess we're still in Eastern Daylight Time. Anyway, 2:15 Syracuse time. I'm not in Syracuse, so I actually have to remember that that's different. We'll have our meeting. So do your reading, come with your questions, and keep on top of those assignments, guys, because this stuff's going to pile up. And as I said, if your grade at midterm is a 0, I will report that it is a 0. And you will have to deal with whatever it is you guys have to deal with. And I don't want that to happen. And if you need any help with any of these assignments, please email me, or come to my virtual office hours. I'd be more than happy to talk to you guys about this stuff. I love talking about this stuff, especially this stuff. This stuff's great. We're finally getting into some literature. We're not just talking blandly about Japan. And so I hope to hear from you guys soon. Have a good week.